A bell tolls in the fog, but no one turns to look. Somewhere in a forgotten chapel above Paris, a secret waits, woven in silence, written in shadows, and guarded by the past itself. What would you do if the truth could burn more than it could heal? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was in the early spring of the year 1894, when the frost had lifted, but the streets of London still bore the grey temperament of winter, that I observed in Sherlock Holmes a peculiar quietude. Our rooms at Baker Street were unusually still, save for the soft rustle of paper and the occasional scrape of a chair across the floor. Holmes had immersed himself in a stack of ecclesiastical treatises, Latin-bound folios with dry, scholarly titles, some of them borrowed from the Bodleian. Though I attempted once or twice to rouse him with talk of the papers or the morning mail, he waved me off with a single raised finger, his mind fixed upon some abstraction I could not yet fathom. It was on such a morning, grey, damp, and fragrant with pipe tobacco, that our quiet was broken by a soft but deliberate knock. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man of sombre aspect, whose presence altered the air of the room as surely as if a censer had been lit. Clad in a long, rain-dark cassock, and with a face framed by the faint stubble of recent sorrow, the visitor smelled faintly of incense and wet masonry. He removed his hat with a trembling hand and inclined his head to Holmes in a gesture that was equal parts reverence and unease. I confess, I felt the hairs along my arm rise without knowing precisely why. The man, though plainly dressed, bore marks of distinction, or at least of ceremony long endured. His sleeves were frayed at the cuffs, yet the stitching was ecclesiastical. His boots, though clean, were worn in a manner suggesting habitual pacing over stone. Holmes, still seated and silent, observed these details as a naturalist might study a beetle under glass. I, for my part, was struck by the man's nervous fingers, which seemed to fidget with some inner debate. He looked not so much like a priest as a man who had once been one, or perhaps still was, in secret defiance of something left behind. "My dear sir," Holmes said at last, "you come from Paris by way of Calais, though not by the express, and I presume you carry a relic of more historical than spiritual value hidden within your left inner pocket." The man froze. I, being less accustomed to Holmes's theatrical timing, nearly spilled my tea. "The damp on your hem suggests a crypt, specifically one with unfinished stone," Holmes continued. "Your cuffs speak of a cassock worn regularly, but not in active ministry, and your shoes, though recently polished, bear the red residue of Montmartre dust. But it is the parchment pressing against your chest that truly interests me." The man's eyes widened. He reached instinctively for the breast of his cassock, whereupon Holmes raised a cautionary hand. "There is no need," said he. "The outline is plain, and the stiffness of the fold suggests a single sheet of considerable age. Vellum, if I'm not mistaken, and tightly wound. You did not come to speak of sacraments or absolution, monsieur. You came because someone else already knows you have it." The man lowered his hand slowly and sat, his voice trembling as he said, "Monsieur Holmes, I believe I am in grave danger." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers, the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Then, doctor," he said softly, "I suspect we are once again to be drawn into matters of smoke, shadow, and silent conspiracies. Only this time, the scent of incense may prove more lethal than gunpowder." And with that, I realized the stillness of Baker Street had ended, and something far older was stirring from across the channel. The man who now sat before us, clutching his hat in both hands, introduced himself in quiet tones as Monsieur Jules Renaud of Paris, formerly attached to the curatorial office of religious monuments. His English was formal, carefully chosen, with just enough hesitation to suggest he had rehearsed every phrase before crossing the channel. "The church," he said, "is scarcely more than a ruin, monsieur. It has stood empty for decades. A place where pigeons outnumber prayers." He went on to describe a 13th century stone chapel tucked in the Montmartre hillside, half swallowed by time. During a private project involving the retrieval of antique tabernacles for the Musée de Cluny, Renaud had volunteered to assist with the initial inspection. It was behind the altar, beneath a decaying panel of stone and lime, that he discovered a narrow cavity, and within it, a tightly rolled piece of parchment bound in faded ribbon. "By all appearances," he added, eyes lowered, "I ought to have handed it over to the ministry, but I did not." Here he paused. "I believed it was intended for me, or rather, for my family." Holmes said nothing, but I saw his eyes sharpen. "The document," Renaud continued, "was written in Latin, at least in part, but interspersed among the phrases were what appeared to be musical notations, as in Gregorian chant. Strange symbols, not quite letters, arranged with careful spacing, some marked with circles and others crossed through." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his long fingers now templed beneath his chin. "You copied it?" "Yes," Renaud nodded. "Faithfully, before the original was returned to its hiding place. I feared removing it entirely might awaken interest in quarters I could not control." "A wise instinct," Holmes murmured. "And you did not attempt to decipher it yourself?" "I tried," said Renaud, "but I lack the scholar's patience. There were phrases I recognized, in nomine, gloria, and others, but the structure was fragmented. I suspected it was more than a devotional passage. I began to wonder whether the music itself held a message." Holmes glanced at me with that familiar twinkle. "Watson, we are in the company of a man who sees notes where others see prayer." There followed a silence, and then with visible reluctance, Renaud spoke again. "My uncle," he said, "was the last to hold mass in that church. Bishop Alexandre Verviers. Perhaps the name means little in England, but in Paris it was once spoken with reverence. Until the war. He meant the Franco-Prussian War, of course, whose embers still smouldered in French memory. There were whispers," Renaud continued, "that the bishop had dealings, that he served not only the church, but other interests which may have compromised men of position. He was removed from office in 1872 and retired in shame. He died 10 years later, penniless and forgotten." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you believe this parchment connects to that past?" "I cannot say for certain," said Renaud, "but I know this. My uncle never allowed the altar to be disturbed, not once in 40 years. I saw Holmes' eyes gleam at the word altar. He had always distrusted holy things that hid profane secrets." Renaud's voice dropped lower still, and he leaned toward us, as if confessing in a confessional box. "There is more," he said. "Since my return to London, I have felt observed." He hesitated. "At first it was no more than a feeling, a presence behind me in the fog, a shadow that disappeared when I turned. Then came the incident at Euston. A man I passed 3 times on the platform, always reading the same newspaper, always in the same stance. And 2 days ago, I found a corner of my lodging room window unlatched, though I had locked it myself before leaving." Holmes's brow rose slightly. "You are not given to fantasy, Monsieur Renaud." "I am not. I believe someone knows of the scroll, or suspects. I cannot think how, but the sensation is no longer doubt. It is certainty." "Then you are either being hunted," said Holmes, "or led." Holmes stood and paced a half-turn before the fireplace, then stopped abruptly and turned to our guest. "Your shoes are new, but not purchased in England. French cut, reinforced soles, likely from the Rue Montorgueil. Yet the laces are different and recently rethreaded. The left heel bears scuffing inconsistent with the wear on the right. suggesting the aid of another, taller man on a steep incline. Your outer cloak, though brushed clean, holds two fibres, one grey wool, the other ivory silk, and your ink-stained thumb, Monsieur Renaud, tells me that you were not alone when you discovered the document. The man blanched. You brought someone with you to the church, someone who helped you remove the panel and who handled the parchment before you did. A woman, perhaps. Renaud's jaw tightened. Yes, he whispered, but she's not involved in any of this. She was only curious. And You told her nothing, Holmes said, but she may have learned more than you realize. There followed a silence that Holmes did not rush to fill. When he finally spoke, it was with an air of grave determination. I believe, Watson, he said, that we are no longer in the realm of ancient scribes and forgotten monks. This matter touches the edges of diplomacy, secrecy, and old crimes best left buried. He turned back to Renaud. I must see this church with my own eyes. We shall travel tonight. Watson, prepare your coat and revolver. My revolver? I repeated, startled. Holmes merely raised an eyebrow. Churches built in the 13th century are seldom empty, even when they appear so. And a man who finds himself watched is usually not the only one in danger. He handed Renaud his hat with a motion that was oddly formal. We will accompany you, monsieur. And if the walls of Montmartre whisper secrets, I dare say we shall coax them into singing. And with that, the matter was settled. Our arrival in Paris was met with a grey dawn and the melancholy whistle of a distant train, as if the city itself were reluctant to awaken. Holmes, ever efficient in travel, wasted no time with pleasantries and had us conveyed at once to the district of Montmartre. The streets, narrow and slick with the recent rain, led us to a forgotten hill where stood the church of Saint-Benoît-des-Silences, a building more corpse than cathedral. Time had worn away its painted saints and chipped its stone angels. The windows, once vibrant with stained glass, were boarded or broken, and the heavy door yielded only after Holmes pressed his shoulder to it. Inside, the air was cool and damp, tinged with the familiar bitterness of old incense and decaying wood. Holmes stood very still in the nave, his gaze sweeping the vaulted ceiling, the floor, the pews, and finally, the altar itself. It breathes, he murmured. I glanced at him. The church? No, he replied. The secret. It still breathes within these stones. We proceeded to the altar, which was plain, Romanesque in style, and flanked by two rusted iron sconces. Behind it, the recess Monsieur Renaud had described was visible, though barely. A subtle rectangle of lighter stone betrayed where the panel had been pried free. Holmes crouched, drew a magnifying glass from his coat, and ran a gloved finger along the edges of the cavity. I knew better than to speak. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the distant creak of pigeons in the rafters. Curious, he said at last, gesturing for me to come closer. Note the chisel marks, Watson. Fresh, but not singular. This recess has been opened not once, but twice. Twice, I echoed. Then Renaud was not the only one to... Precisely. The first disturbance dislodged the mortar on the left. The second disturbed the right edge. Two separate entries, two separate occasions. He rose and brushed the dust from his knees. Observe also the waxy residue along the base. Someone lit a taper here recently. And here, a hairline smear, too small to be deliberate. Lip rouge, Watson. I blinked. A woman? Quite so, he replied. And one not content to merely read history, but to rewrite it. That afternoon, acting upon Holmes's quiet insistence, we visited a modest bookshop not far from the church. La Librairie Verviers, as noted in Renaud's brief itinerary. It was a cramped, dusty place, with volumes stacked in uneven towers, and a proprietress who seemed too poised for such disorder. Mademoiselle Emilie Verviers greeted us with polite reserve. She was pale, composed, and possessed of that rare stillness I had come to associate with two sorts of women, governesses and actresses. "Ah," she said, upon hearing our purpose. "Yes, the church. A curious place. They say it was once the site of a heretical brotherhood, though that's just legend. Or so the historians claim." Holmes smiled. "And yet you speak as one who's read their records." She offered a faint smile in return. "I read many things, monsieur." Holmes asked a few casual questions, to which she responded smoothly. But as we left, he remarked quietly, "Did you catch it, Watson?" "Catch what?" She corrected me on the bishop's date of removal before I ever said it. I turned, which means she knows far more than she's willing to admit. Back in our modest Paris lodgings, Holmes at once withdrew from his coat a neatly folded copy of the parchment transcription provided by Renaud. He spread it across the desk and retrieved a second sheet of paper upon which he began sketching rows of musical staff lines. "You see, Watson," he began, "the Latin fragments are pedestrian, psalm excerpts, fragments of the Magnificat. But what's clever is their pairing with neumes, a form of primitive notation used in Gregorian chant. Look here. The words appear to follow the structure of a hymn, but the musical symbols are inconsistent with sacred rhythm." He tapped his pencil at several lines. "These notes form an impossible melody, and yet, if you consider pitch not as sound, but as alphabetical interval, C as the third letter, D as the fourth, then suddenly the structure becomes linguistic." I leaned in, squinting. "Then it's not music at all." "It is camouflage," he replied. "The notation is meant to be read sideways, like a monk would mark a psalter to remember names tied to dates." "And what does the music say?" Holmes smiled faintly, that this code was not written to praise heaven, but to remember treachery. At Holmes's suggestion, I paid a visit to one Monsieur Adrien Latouche, a retired archivist of some distinction, who resided in a cramped apartment overlooking the Rue du Faubourg. The old gentleman received me warmly and was only too delighted to reminisce about the ecclesiastical oddities of Paris. "Saint Benoît de Silence," he said. "Ah yes, it once held great favour among certain aristocratic families. That altar, did you notice the plaque behind it? There was once an engraving of names there, donors and patrons of the mid-19th century." "I saw only a dark rectangle," I replied. "Precisely," he said, raising a finger. "The list was removed, chiselled off in 1873. Not replaced, mind you, erased. That sort of thing happens when a name becomes politically dangerous. If you ask me, one of those names fell out of grace. Spectacularly so. Do you know which?" He hesitated, then chuckled. "There are guesses, monsieur. Always guesses. The Vicomte d'Aubigny was rumoured to have changed his loyalties during the siege of Paris. Letters to the Prussians, it was whispered, but nothing proved. I made my notes and thanked him. Yet as I descended the stairs, I could not shake the feeling that we had stepped into a history someone had paid handsomely to forget. That evening, as the gaslight flickered above our supper table, I recounted the archivist's remarks to Holmes, who nodded with only mild interest. "D'Aubigny," he said. "Yes, I had already formed the suspicion. What remains uncertain is whether the man acted alone, or whether his betrayal was facilitated by others whose reputations remain quite intact." He turned back to the parchment, his finger tracing a sequence of notes now mapped to letters. "But here is the more pressing truth. This cipher was meant to be found, or rather not found for many years, and now too many hands are reaching for it at once." "You mean someone else is deciphering it?" "I believe someone already has, or nearly so. We are, Watson, not alone in this investigation. Observe. Yesterday there was a minute crease along the edge of this parchment. This morning it is no longer present. You think someone tampered with it?" "I think," said Holmes. That someone visited our rooms while we were at the church. And if they are reading the same notes I am, then it is not the past they seek to preserve, but the future they mean to control. Holmes had worked through the night, and when I awoke just after dawn, I found him seated cross-legged upon the floor, surrounded by scattered sheets of notation and Latin fragments. His eyes glittered with the peculiar, cold energy that only the scent of revelation could summon in him. "It's not the words, Watson," he said without looking up. "It's the rhythm. The chant is irregular, but not random. It forms a cadence, an architectural clue." I blinked, still half asleep. "A what?" Holmes tapped the parchment. "Listen carefully. Telucis ante terminum, custodium per noctem," but with false intervals. These markings are misaligned intentionally. Someone used the chant's pattern as a spatial mnemonic. He unfolded a drawing he had made, an architectural plan of sorts, overlaid with the chant's phrasing. Each stanza aligns with physical space. The verse that halts mid-line, it breaks over the southern transept. That's our axis. An hour later, we stood again in the church, Holmes pacing quietly along the nave until he paused at a cracked stone tile near the choir steps. He knelt, pressed gently, and the stone shifted. Beneath it, a narrow shaft descending into blackness. "I believe," he said softly, "the hymn was written to open the past." The opening led to a narrow space no wider than a coffin and scarcely higher than my shoulders. With lantern in hand, I followed Holmes into the gloom, my boots scraping against cold flagstones. The air was thick with mildew, and something else, the faintest tang of old smoke. At the far end of the crawl space lay a shallow alcove hewn into the wall, like a burial niche. Within it, a warped leather satchel and a heavy iron candelabrum crusted with wax. Holmes knelt and opened the satchel with careful hands. Inside were fragments of parchment, blackened at the edges and brittle with time. He lifted one with tweezers and examined it under the lantern's glow. "Burned deliberately," he murmured. "But not entirely. The ink still breathes between the scorches." On the reverse of one sheet, he pointed out a crest, half seared but still visible. "D'Aubigny," I said quietly. "The same family the historian mentioned." Holmes gave a tight nod. "This confirms it. The bishop was keeper to a record, a ledger of betrayal. But someone got here first and tried to erase it." I frowned. "Then why not burn it all?" Holmes folded the parchment and stood. "Because they were interrupted, or frightened, or both." We had barely cleared the crawl space and re-emerged into the damp half-light of the church, when a familiar voice echoed through the nave. "You shouldn't have come back." We turned. Emily Verviers stood beneath the broken arch of the northern aisle, her cloak drawn tightly about her, eyes sharp and glinting like the steel buckles at her collar. Holmes offered her a courteous bow. "On the contrary, Mademoiselle Verviers, we never truly left." She stepped forward slowly, her gaze passing from Holmes to me and finally to the fold of parchment in his hand. "So you found it?" "Only what was left," Holmes replied. "Someone made certain the record would remain partial." Her lips tightened. "I had no part in that. It was never mine to destroy." Holmes tilted his head. "Yet it was yours to discover." She hesitated, then exhaled. "Yes," she said at last. "It was I who found the code, months ago, hidden behind the altar. I was researching my father's correspondence. Bishop Verviers was not merely a distant relative. He was my blood." I glanced at Holmes, startled. Emily continued. "I kept it hidden, but Jules, Monsieur Renaud, followed me. He took it. He claimed it was rightfully his, but he never understood its meaning." "And you did?" Holmes asked. She looked away. "Enough to know it should never be read aloud." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then very softly he said, You've told us the truth, mademoiselle, but not all of it. Emily stiffened. I've said what matters. Then let me add what was omitted. Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall the parchment we examined yesterday? The ink had faded at intervals, but curiously, in patterns that did not match age or fire. He faced Emily again. You tampered with it, not to destroy, but to alter. Selectively. A name here, a date there. Her face flushed. I was only correcting, omitting names that would harm the innocent. That was never my father's purpose. And yet, Holmes said gently, such editorial instinct is rarely found in those with clean hands. She folded her arms. What would you have done? Publish it and let history devour the living along with the dead? Holmes said nothing. It was Renaud who spoke next. He had arrived unnoticed, his eyes red-rimmed and wet with fury. You told me it was nothing, he cried, that it was devotional rubbish. Emily's face turned pale. I was trying to protect you. From what? He shouted. From the truth, or from the danger of knowing it better than you? Holmes stepped between them. Enough. The ledger is real. The secrets are no longer yours to hoard or to hide. That night, upon returning to our modest rooms near the Rue Lamarck, Holmes found something unusual. The door, which had been locked securely, bore no signs of forced entry, and yet, there on the parlour table, between the decanter and the folded evening paper, lay a single sheet of cream stationery. Holmes lifted it delicately between thumb and forefinger. Upon it, written in precise slanting script, were the words, "Some shadows should remain. You will not be warned again. Le veilleur." Le veilleur, I read aloud. The watcher. Holmes nodded grimly. A nom de guerre, of course, but elegantly chosen. Whoever he is, he wishes to be seen as custodian of something sacred or dangerous. I glanced about the room. But how did he get in? With a key, Holmes replied. Perhaps, too, it is likely we were watched for some time. He turned the paper over and held it near the lamp. Ah, scented, myrrh and cedar, an ecclesiastical mixture. Our watcher, it seems, walks in robes when he must. I felt a chill despite the fire. Is this a threat, Holmes? Holmes tucked the note into his breast pocket. It is an invitation, Watson. One rarely receives a warning unless one is close to something worth silencing. Over the following 2 days, Holmes laboured in growing silence. He said little, ate even less, and seemed entirely consumed by the parchment, which he reassembled like a puzzle of fire and ink. At last, on the morning of the 3rd day, he beckoned me to the desk with a quiet gesture. It is a ledger, he said, but not of gold, nor grain, nor sin. It is a record of names, aristocrats, clergy, even diplomats, tied to a series of covert transactions during the war. I studied the page. Bribes? Worse, Holmes replied. Arranged surrenders. Safe passages sold to the Prussians in exchange for titles, lands and guarantees. And Bishop Verviers, a go-between, a man of access, not malice. But the ink here, this entry, names the Vicomte d'Aubigny directly. I whistled. That name still carries weight in Parliament. Holmes nodded. And here lies the danger. To expose this is to upend power that still walks the corridors of Europe. And Le Veilleur, he is a guardian of the past, but not for justice, for containment. He will kill Watson, not to preserve truth, but to stop its collapse. Holmes folded the sheet. We now hold a truth which no one wants revealed, and which no one dares ignore. That, he said quietly, is when the real danger begins. It was Holmes' idea to make the truth appear public. If we wish to draw the rat, he said, we must rattle the pantry. The invitation went out discreetly, but with sufficient fanfare to stir Parisian circles interested in history, theology, or scandal, under the guise of a scholarly demonstration of medieval liturgical codes. Holmes announced a private decoding of the Montmartre scroll to be held in the crypt of Saint-Benoît des Silences. Monsieur Renaud, Holmes said, will serve as patron of the event. Mademoiselle Verviers, if she chooses to attend, shall be its conscience. And Le Veilleur? I asked. He shall be the guest of honour, Holmes replied, whether he receives the invitation or not. The day arrived grim and overcast. The pews had been dusted and a small lectern placed before the altar, beneath which a ladder led to the crypt. A handful of onlookers, historians, clerks and clerics, filtered in, murmuring over the promise of hidden knowledge. Holmes, elegant as ever, wore a black suit and grey gloves. I took my place beside him, my revolver concealed in my coat pocket. Renaud appeared late, visibly nervous. Emily came last, standing silently at the back, her eyes unreadable. And then, when Holmes began to speak, I felt it, the presence of someone watching who had not been invited. With measured solemnity, Holmes invited the attendees down into the crypt. The chamber beneath the altar had been cleared, swept and fitted with 3 oil lamps that cast long shadows against the damp stone walls. The effect was almost theatrical, and Holmes, ever the conductor of performances, used it to great advantage. Upon the stone pedestal stood a parchment scroll, aged, creased and sealed with red wax. It was not the real cipher, of course, but a forgery painstakingly created by Holmes over 2 sleepless nights. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you see before you is a piece of encoded history, fragmentary, sacred and dangerous. Its verses echo chant but conceal truths of an altogether less divine nature." The audience leaned in. Holmes spoke of neumes, intervals, and Latin half-phrases, all while deftly misinterpreting the code in small calculated ways. His goal, I realised, was not to enlighten the crowd, but to provoke someone into revealing their hand. My eyes scanned the room. Renaud stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Emily's hands were folded tight against her cloak, but it was the man in the back, tall, gaunt, too still, who held my gaze. He stepped forward silently, like a man accustomed to command. Holmes turned to him, his expression unchanging. "Monsieur," said the man, in a voice gravelled by age and certainty, "you are meddling with matters you do not understand." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then by all means, enlighten us." I felt the tension shift like air before a storm. The game had begun, and the general had stepped onto the stage. He removed his hat with military precision and tucked it beneath his arm. His coat, though civilian, bore the trim and cut of a man who had not yet surrendered the habits of a uniform. The crowd sensed the change at once. Silence gathered like fog. "I am General Armand de Villeroy," the man said, "retired from the Chasseurs Alpins, decorated at Sedan and Strasbourg. I speak here not for myself, but for France." "No doubt," Holmes replied dryly, "as so many traitors have." The general's eyes narrowed. "You mock at peril. What lies on that parchment can rupture the marrow of this country. You think it noble to reveal every shadow cast by war. The Church forgives, the Republic forgets. Only fools disturb graves." "Then consider me among the grave diggers," Holmes said. Renaud stepped forward, trembling. "You were my uncle's friend. You visited him in exile." De Villeroy ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on Holmes. "You have no idea what you risk," he said. "One name on that list sits in the Foreign Office. Another married into the Belgian court. A third commands troops still stationed in Alsace." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "you came not to destroy the parchment, but to see whether I had the right one." The general flinched. Holmes turned to the lectern, lifted the false scroll, and rolled it tight. "I assure you, General, this is a shadow. The substance was moved days ago." A pause. Then Holmes added quietly, "To London." The general's lips parted, but no words came. I saw his hands twitch ever so slightly, whether toward violence or retreat. I could not tell. Holmes continued, voice cool and unhurried. I anticipated your move, General, before you ever left your drawing room. While you arranged watches and letters slipped under doors, I made other arrangements. He turned to the audience with a calm smile. A courier, registered under a false name, left for Calais 3 days ago. The real document is now secured within the walls of the British consulate, with instructions that it be delivered to Her Majesty's government, unless I fail to send word within 24 hours. You bluff, de Villeroy growled. Holmes met his gaze. Do you wish to test the theory? For the first time, the general seemed to age. His shoulders sagged. His hand fell away from his coat. It was not my betrayal, he muttered, almost to himself. I merely buried it. Holmes offered a nod, not of sympathy but of acknowledgement. And yet you buried it alive. Renaud turned to Holmes. And now? Now, said Holmes, we allow the past to answer for itself. Whether the British government deems this record fit for light or for fire is no longer our burden. But the names, I said, they remain powerful. Holmes looked at me. Power has never been the same as honour, Watson. History is proof of that. No sooner had the general withdrawn than Holmes turned his gaze, calm and unblinking, upon Mademoiselle Verviers. She did not flinch beneath it, but I noted a subtle stiffness in her jaw, a preparedness born not of guilt, but of expectation. There is something more you wish to say, Mr. Holmes? She asked evenly. There is, Holmes replied. You speak as a woman wronged, by history, by inheritance, by men who choose secrets over truths. But you have not been idle. The fragment you showed us first, the one you claimed was untouched by fire, it was not drawn from the crypt at all. She said nothing. It was forged, Holmes continued, with exquisite care. The vellum was aged by damp. The ink, an ecclesiastical mixture, but newly applied. A fine deception, except for the note spacing. You placed rests between notations where the original chant would never have permitted them. You did not expect a musician. Still she did not speak. Why? I asked, though I already knew. To alter the narrative, Holmes said quietly, to shift implication away from certain names and to cast light upon others. You wish to guide the eye of any reader. In short, you hope to control the fallout. Her eyes narrowed. And would you not do the same, Mr. Holmes? Were your own father named in the lines? I am not a daughter of disgraced bishops, Holmes answered, but I respect the instinct. She turned to leave. Where will you go? I asked. She paused at the arch. Somewhere forgotten. I've grown skilled at finding such places. And then she was gone, leaving only the whisper of her heel across the stone and the smell of lavender and ash behind her. Renaud remained behind long after the others had dispersed. He sat on a low stone bench near the crypt steps, shoulders hunched, his face pale with something between rage and revelation. I was never meant to find it, was I? He said at last. Not the code, not the journal, not even the church. Holmes joined him without comment, the silence between them heavier than any sermon. She used me, Renaud continued, not cruelly, not even selfishly, but deliberately. I was the foot that cracked the seal, the name that could open doors without suspicion. Holmes folded his arms. You were the nephew, the historian, the man with just enough access and just enough ignorance to be convincing. And I believed I was uncovering my family's redemption, he said bitterly, that I might restore my uncle's name. Instead, Holmes said, you discovered that your uncle's legacy was not tarnished, but true. He was a man who served many masters and left behind truths sharp enough to cut even in silence. Renaud looked up at Holmes. And what of justice? Holmes offered a faint smile. Justice is a fine ideal, monsieur, but it walks more slowly than memory, and with worse shoes. He left Renaud to his thoughts. I followed. feeling that in this case, at least, the lines between victim and accomplice were not drawn in chalk, but in candle smoke. It was the morning following the final confrontation, and Holmes, ever unwilling to leave a question unvoiced, had seated himself by the fire in our modest hotel drawing room, with a pipe balanced precariously on his lower lip and a stack of monkish parchment before him. I, bleary-eyed and still unsettled by the emotional tremors of the day before, found him already deep in thought. "It is extraordinary," I remarked, "how you trace such treachery through fragments of melody." Holmes smiled faintly. "Music, my dear Watson, has long been the vessel of secrets, but in this case, it was not the notes alone, but their silences." He lifted a page and tapped the faint staves. "This chant was never intended for liturgical use. It mimicked the form, yes, but look closely. The placement of rests, the unnatural clefs, deliberate errors, you might say. They were markers, each corresponding not to harmony, but to entries." "To names?" I asked. "Precisely. Latin abbreviations spliced between musical notation. It required knowledge of Gregorian notation, of ecclesiastical calendars, and of the private abbreviations used by the bishopric of Avranches during wartime. Each phrase was a line in a hidden ledger, and the content," he inhaled, "lists of couriers, dates, pseudonyms, transactions. The old bishop, it seems, took down his confidences in ink and plain chant. Many of them concerned the conduct of officers now occupying fine salons in Paris and London alike." I could not suppress a shiver. So it was not simply heresy, but history he had hidden beneath his own altar. "Quite so, and history, once buried, is all the more dangerous for being exhumed." He flicked the final sheet away as if shaking off dust. "A choir of names, Watson, and every one of them out of tune with honour." "It was the ring, of course," Holmes murmured, as we took our afternoon tea in the courtyard. "The ring told me first." I stared at him. "You mean Emily's?" He nodded, reaching into his pocket and producing a small notebook. It bore the episcopal seal. "Yes, but not the public one used in ordinances. This was the personal emblem used only on confidential correspondence between the Bishop of Avranches and the underground clergy. The design, a circlet of thorns around a pierced heart, was removed from circulation following the bishop's sudden death in 1872. "How could she have come by such a thing?" I asked. "Family, Watson. It was not passed through purchase or theft. It was inherited. The old bishop, contrary to expectation, had a child." I blinked. "You mean to say she is his daughter?" Holmes confirmed. "Illegitimate, no doubt, but dearly protected. Her presence in the circle of cryptographers was no coincidence. She had spent years collecting fragments of the old correspondence, pieces her father had entrusted to nuns and archivists. It was not vengeance that brought her to us, but lineage. She sought truth to preserve a name she could never publicly claim." I considered that quietly. "And so she forged one sliver of the code, to redirect attention, to erase the suggestion that her father betrayed his oath or aided the enemy. She walked a fine line, Watson, between recovery and revision." "There was, you may recall," Holmes began later that evening, "a scent I noted when we first entered the sanctuary. You thought it incense. I disagreed." "Of course," I said, recalling the moment. "You mentioned something metallic in it." "Not incense," Holmes replied, "but an oil-based compound used in military boot polish, particularly by the French cavalry during the Third Republic. The general, Le Veilleur, had stood at that pulpit no later than 3 days before us. He left behind a smear no wider than a shilling. And this helped you connect him to the scene. More than that, it confirmed the pattern. His denial of having entered the crypt was a poor falsehood. You will remember how quickly he attempted to dismiss the cipher as a priestly fantasy. He feared recognition, not from us, but from the paper itself." He paced once. I found the residue caught beneath the carved lilies beside the steps, and further still, the imprint of a hobnail boot near the base of the altar, partially wiped, but deep. You're telling me he came prepared, I said slowly, to remove the ledger himself. He believed it might still be there, and failing that, he meant to destroy the setting which had kept it hidden. But history, Watson, has a peculiar way of leaving footprints, particularly when made in polished leather. He gave a half smile. He mistook reverence for silence, but stone records more than prayers. We left Paris the following morning, though my thoughts lingered on that ancient church and its choir of secrets. Holmes, however, remained characteristically composed, as if the puzzle had never burdened him at all. Only once we boarded the train to Calais did he offer his final summation. "It is always the silence that speaks loudest, Watson," he said, tapping the glass of the compartment window. The General's silence, in particular, was too symmetrical. "You mean rehearsed?" "I mean engineered. He erased himself from the chain of evidence with surgical precision. Too little doubt, too much absence. In a case where others fumbled for excuses, he had none to offer. That, to me, was conclusive." "And yet," I countered, "Emily lied as well." "She did," he conceded, "but not out of malice. The General buried the truth to preserve his status. Emily bent it to protect a memory. They were both, in a fashion, historians, but of very different schools." I nodded. "And they misjudged each other?" "Entirely," Holmes replied. "He believed her naive, an idealist clutching dusty relics. She, in turn, mistook him for a relic himself. In reality, they were mirrors, each seeking to preserve a version of the past they could live with." I could not help but ask, "And Renaud?" Holmes tilted his head. "Ah, the scholar who became the match, lit by both, burnt by both. I pity him most. He believed in facts, but found only shadows." The train surged forward, drawing us from the fading city. "History," Holmes said, lighting his pipe, "is not written in ink alone. It sings, it lies, and occasionally, if one listens closely, it confesses." As the train hummed along the northern tracks, bound for Calais and then England, I found myself pacing the narrow corridor between compartments, hands behind my back, muttering aloud in a state that bordered on vexation. I finally flung open the door to our carriage and faced Holmes, who sat serenely cross-legged, leafing through a well-thumbed volume of medieval liturgical canons, as though he had just returned from a day at the cricket grounds. "Holmes," I said, unable to contain myself, "you might have spared me at least a fragment of your reasoning as events unfolded." I've no doubt I looked a perfect fool standing there, mouth agape, while you unravelled half a century of secrets. He did not look up. "My dear Watson," he said, "you look no more foolish than usual, perhaps slightly more poetic." I spluttered. "Poetic?" I was positively floundering. Holmes closed the book with a gentle snap. "And yet, floundering is sometimes the sincerest form of learning. You observe the ripples without knowing where the stone fell. It sharpens the instincts." I gave a short laugh. "Your instincts, perhaps. Yours as well, when unburdened by assumption." He reached into his pocket and retrieved a boiled sweet, which he offered with infuriating geniality. "Take comfort, Watson. I once kept Lestrade in the dark for 3 weeks during the case of the penitent grenadier. I'm not Lestrade, which is why I only kept you in the dark for 3 days. I accepted the sweet in reluctant truce, but not without one last muttered remark about his maddening methods." Holmes merely smiled, as if it were all a game, and I the fortunate, if unknowing, second player. The countryside unfurled beside us like a tapestry of half-forgotten sermons. Holmes had fallen into one of his characteristic silences, his gaze distant and inward, as though the iron wheels beneath us were not carrying him back to Baker Street, but further into the winding corridors of the case itself. At last, I ventured to speak. "You said something last night that struck me, about history singing lies." Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes still fixed on the passing fields. "Indeed. The most dangerous kind of falsehood is the one with a cathedral built over it." He turned then and looked at me fully. "What we unearthed beneath that church, Watson, was not merely a cipher, it was a ledger of consequences. Some had long passed into death, others still walked in polished boots and parliamentary robes, but all were tethered to that hidden harmony of betrayal. And yet," I said, "you did not expose them." "No," he replied quietly, "nor will I." There was a pause in which only the rhythmic clatter of the train filled the silence between us. "You disapprove?" he asked. I considered. "I struggle with it. Surely justice demands light." Holmes gave a short breath of a laugh. "Justice, perhaps, but peace demands discretion. The sins of the fathers, as they say, are often best left buried, particularly when the sons have built nations upon them." He lit a match, held it to his pipe, and continued. "We live in a world that swears by the sanctity of archives and tombstones, but I have seen men destroyed by truths too heavy to be borne. The general, for all his vanity, sought to erase scandal not for himself, but for France. And Emily? She sought to rewrite it, not for glory, but for dignity." I stared at the smoke rising in gentle spirals. "In the end," Holmes said, "they were both historians. But I am only a detective. I follow the notes until the music stops." And with that, he leaned back into his seat, closed his eyes, and said no more until we reached the sea. The final shadows of day stretched long across the steps of the Église Saint-Pierre as Holmes and I descended from the heights of Montmartre. The bells had just begun their low, resonant tolling, filling the air with a sound that was neither mournful nor jubilant, but somewhere in between, as if Paris herself were exhaling the secrets we had left buried beneath her stones. Holmes walked with his usual unhurried gait, his cane tapping rhythmically against the ancient cobblestones, while I kept pace at his side, casting a glance now and again at the rose-stained windows aglow behind us. "It's strange, Holmes," I said quietly. "The entire matter, the cipher, the general, the girl, all of it will remain locked away. No report, no trial, nothing." He did not answer, but merely inclined his head toward the sound of the bells. There are moments when even Holmes respects silence more than speech, and I sensed that this was one of them. Whatever truth we had unearthed, it now belonged to that twilight realm, known fully only to the two of us and the echoing chimes above a city that would never know. As we turned into the narrow Rue des Trois Frères, I found the weight of our silence intolerable. "Surely," I began, "you cannot believe it just to let the truth rest unspoken. There are matters here. Forgery, deception, and worse." Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes thoughtful. "Quite so. And yet, would the speaking of them serve justice? Or merely scandal? But Emily, Miss Verviers," he interrupted, "is guilty of sentimentality and of artifice. But she is also, in her fashion, a victim. Much like Renaud, much like the general, in his final, twisted design." "You sound almost sympathetic," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Sympathy is a luxury I cannot afford, Watson, but I do possess judgment. And in judgment, I find that truth, the whole of it, is rarely a balm. It cuts as often as it heals." I frowned. "Then what becomes of justice?" He stopped walking and looked up at a balcony where vines clung stubbornly to iron railings. "Justice is not a uniform thing. It does not always parade in robes or conclude with applause. Sometimes it is quieter than that, a choice not taken, a truth withheld for the greater good. We resumed our walk. I felt the weight of his words, though part of me rebelled against them. But where does it end, Holmes? If we begin silencing truth for convenience, do we not risk losing it altogether? His answer came softly, almost wistfully. Perhaps, Watson, but then, perhaps we have already lost more than we dare admit. We reached the foot of the hill as the lamplighters made their rounds, striking their wicks and leaving golden orbs against the gathering blue. Holmes paused at a corner where the pavement met a modest square, extracted a cigarette from his case and struck a match with a practiced flick. I watched the flame dance upon the paper and tobacco before he drew it in. The smoke curled like a spectre toward the fading sky. You once said, I remarked, that every code can be broken, given enough patience and intellect. Holmes exhaled. Yes, but not all codes should be. Some are written not to protect the truth, but to protect those it would destroy. And that's where we leave it. He looked at me sidelong. Justice is not always served on parchment, Watson. Sometimes it echoes in the choices we do not make. A boy approached with telegrams slung in a leather pouch, and Holmes accepted the one addressed in familiar London scrawl. He unfolded it, his expression unreadable. Well, I asked. He tapped the paper against his palm. An old name, a locked room, a very persistent inspector. I raised an eyebrow. Lestrade? Who else? He said with a sigh. Shall we catch the morning steamer? I nodded, and as we turned toward the Rue de Dunkerque, Holmes flicked the remains of his cigarette into a drain. Behind us, the bells tolled once more, but this time, I fancied they were bidding farewell. As we crossed the threshold of our Baker Street lodgings that misty evening, Holmes tossed his gloves to the side table with an air of weary satisfaction. I could not resist one final remark. You knew from the beginning that she was not who she claimed to be, I said, still baffled by the layered web of deceit we had unravelled. Holmes gave a faint smile, lighting a cigarette with a deliberate calm. My dear Watson, identity is rarely a fixed thing. It is a mask, sometimes self-imposed, sometimes inherited. The general sought to erase a shameful legacy, while the daughter sought to forge a legacy of her own. Both, in their way, were storytellers. Only one had the facts on her side. He exhaled slowly. And that, Watson, is the final irony. The past does not forgive, but it occasionally allows discretion to speak louder than justice. What do you think was the greater deception? The forged cipher, or the silence kept for decades beneath the stones of Montmartre? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're here, subscribe for more untold mysteries with Holmes and Watson. If you enjoyed the case, share it with someone who appreciates the quiet weight of secrets.